Good morning, YouTube. What I want to do is go over a couple things. I was playing around with the workflow of bringing audio into OpenTunes and timing out dialogue, which in my case is a bit of a strange methodology because we are taking samples of Japanese speech that don't say anything remotely resembling what our dialogue is, and we're going to use that as a placeholder just because it sounds Japanese, and then put English translations over the top of that. We'll worry about getting proper Japanese voices later. Okay, so one thing I discovered, I should say the one thing that's good is that here in Reaper, which is our audio workstation of choice, I've been using Reaper for years and years, and I've done many soundtracks and musical jingles and all kinds of audio production with Reaper. It's an extremely robust and capable workstation. So anyway, Reaper, if you hit Control-Alt-X, has this essentially Explorer view that will automatically play an audio clip. You get the idea. And it will also actually do tempo matching. So if you're working on a musical project and you want the audio, let's say it consists of beats and things like that, and you want to be able to just drag and drop them in your project, it'll actually do the time stretching automatically. Well, the good news is that this Explorer view in Reaper will allow you to drag and drop audio files directly into OpenTunes, which is cool because you can basically preview them really quickly for like sound effects if you're building up a soundtrack. Now, obviously, well, it may not be obvious, but I will strongly recommend if you're going to build up a complex soundtrack, I would not try to do that in OpenTunes because you're going to want to EQ, you're going to want to have some effects, you're going to wind up with a lot more tracks than you thought you would. That's what always happens. And so you're really asking for trouble if you try to do more than just simple wave files. And you can use MP3s, you can use AIFs, but basically audio files in OpenTunes. Now, what I found out this morning is that when I had I had this scene that consists of a sequence of complex sub-X sheets, because when I go down into the sub-X sheets, they actually consist of quite a few levels. Background images, tinting, yada yada yada. So that's a good way to work, but what I found was when I had a fairly long sequence of these sub-X sheets, followed by what I have in this scene, the battle, which is umpteen quadzillion drawings blocking in all the action that's to come, what would happen is I would load an audio file into OpenTunes and it just wouldn't play. In fact, actually what would happen was it would not play at all, and then like 30 seconds later, out of nowhere, I would hear the audio. Okay, so there's clearly some wackiness in terms of how OpenTunes manages the available memory and where it sticks audio files, for playback. It's a little weird. By contrast, what I found was that when I went ahead and split that complex, really long timeline, or X sheet, into two, where one is the completed sub-X sheets, and then this next scene is just basically the drawings that are going to have to be timed out and inked and painted. Then all of a sudden my audio would play back. So, that's fine. There are limits, and it's not really something to cry about. So where does that leave me this morning? Well, from a workflow standpoint, this is what I think I learned. excuse me, and this is important. When you're dealing with, I'm thinking hard because it's a lot like filmmaking. You know, when I've made a film, okay, I'm writing the story, I'm writing the screenplay. You know, you got to cast it, you got to get out on the set and direct it, you got to edit it, you got to deal with looping and dialogue replacement. Now you got to deal with the soundtrack and the ambience and the Foley, and you got to write the score. There's a lot of steps. One of the questions you will find yourself asking is, in what order should I do these steps? Because one step that you take will screw up your workflow for a later step. Unless your workflow is extremely procedural, which means that changes propagate. An example in OpenTunes of workflow that would be very procedural would be the concept of a sub-X sheet. Because this is a single strip, a single level. But if I go into here a month later and I make one change in this sub-X sheet, that change propagates right up the chain to my final timeline, you know, ostensibly. Now there are limits to that because I'm not, for example, going to contain the entire show in a single timeline. Now it may be possible to do so. I haven't pushed OpenTunes that hard. I'm assuming it probably will sort of fall apart. If you push it too hard, and probably crash a lot and this and that and the other. And that's fine. That's what you expect. You can only go so far. Now, what I've found is with editing, I happen to use Sony Vegas for editing, and this is a good example again of a procedural workflow. Vegas has a concept very similar to a sub-X sheet, which is called a nested project. So you can have a complex project. I'm going to go ahead and pop it up just so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm not going to load the projects, but the upshot of it is that if I drag some video into here, it's going to do the obvious thing, and now I've got a clip in a track. Well, the thing about Vegas is I could have a project that has 20 tracks, you know, a bunch of audio, a bunch of video, whatever. And I can take that, and so that results in a .veg file, so myproject.veg. If I take that veg file and drag it back into Vegas, I wind up with a single clip that represents the nested timeline. And then you can right mouse click on it and open the project that's contained in that. Okay, so that sounds really cool because again, it's procedural. If I have a scene that has a problem, I can make a change in that scene, and the change propagates out to the main timeline of the movie. Now there are limits to it. And one limit is if you nest more than 2 levels deep, it starts to get buggy and crashes. Frankly, it's actually not that robust. If you only go 1 level deep, it's okay. OpenTunes seems to be better, frankly. I think you can nest multiple levels of X sheets, sub-X sheets, multiple levels deep, and OpenTunes doesn't really seem to choke on that. Now, I haven't looked very often at the memory consumption, and when I have looked, you know, we're into the multi-gigabytes of memory for sure. Okay, so that's why I suspect you're asking for trouble if you push it too hard. But getting back to my original point, the question we got to ask ourselves is, in what order should we do things? And I'm trying to think of a way to express this that sort of sums up the rule. The rule would be keep things compact as long as possible. So in this case, the show is essentially like a comic book, okay? So the question becomes, should I drag in the soundtrack and then let's say, let me go ahead and kill the dialogue track just so you can see what I'm talking about here. Now let's say this guy's got a line of dialogue that's going to last for 2 seconds. So he's going to go from There's 1 second. Let's just pretend it's going to be 1 second, and let's pretend Akari responds over half a second. Okay, so now this would be definitely a step that's going to happen soon, where we're breaking this down and figuring out the exact timing of it. But obviously that timing is a function of both editorial discretion. It's an editing function, but it's also a function of the dialogue. The dialogue, if the line of dialogue goes so long, obviously you need to, setting aside the idea of overlapping in order to provide continuity, you do need to let the dialogue dictate to an extent how you edit. So the question now becomes, well, when do you do that? As a creative person, as an artist, one of the things you will fight constantly is the desire to see the work finished, both to prove to yourself that, hey, I can do this and that it's going to look good, and also to sort of, get it wrapped up and get it behind you and on to the next thing. So there's a real temptation. Right now, come on, I have all these shots. Let me just look at this for a second. I have almost well, no, I don't have 500. I've got I'm sorry. I don't want to be stupid here. Okay, let's just say I'm just under 200. We got a few blank frames here, and some of them go by pretty quick, but let's just use the number 200 as a basis. Okay, in an average movie, in an action movie, the cuts tend to average in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 seconds, and they'll go as low as 1 or 2. Sometimes they'll go even faster with a lot of action. In a more sedate drama type movie, the cuts might be as long as, say, 10 seconds. But you can basically do the math, and I've, having edited and produced multiple feature films, I can tell you that those averages are pretty close. And so if this is going to be typical, it's just a show, you could open up your favorite anime and find out for yourself. But the question is, how long are the cuts, on average? Obviously they're faster when there's a lot of action going on. But if we have 200 drawings here, then if we're conservative and we say 5 seconds per cut. In this case, I already know, because it's a lot of dialogue, it's going to be longer than that. But we're going to lose a lot of them to action. So let's say 10 seconds. Well, 10 seconds times 200 drawings, that's 2,000 seconds. 2,000 seconds divided by, 60 seconds per minute. Do the math. 10, 20, 30. Is that right? I hate to be so stupid, but I'm going to run my calculator. If I've got actually, I'm going to do it from the start. Let's do it this way. If we've got 200 drawings, and let's just average 7 seconds a piece. So we've got 1,400 seconds divided by 60 seconds per minute. So we've got, that can't be right. Start over. 200 drawings times 7 seconds a piece. 1,400 seconds divided by 60 seconds per minute. It is correct. That can't be right. That's the whole show. That would be the whole show. Is that right? What am I doing wrong here? Let's assume I'm way, way off. I have 200 drawings, and let's say, since a lot of them are action, let's just really, really be conservative and say they're only going to be 3 seconds a piece. Okay, that's a good round number. Okay, so 600 seconds. Well, this one's pretty obvious. 10 minutes. Okay. I would hate like heck to think that what I have here consists or comprises 10 minutes of movie. But the point is, there's a good bit here. And so getting back to where I started is there's a real temptation to start timing this out. But wait. That's kind of cool from the standpoint of, especially if you drag in the audio, you go, well, you know, my show, it's starting to happen, you know, it feels like a show. It's cool. But you need to take a step back and go, well, wait a minute, this is not something that I would really show anyone. Now, to an extent it is. I should qualify that statement. You might show it to someone if you're floating it to a network or a distributor to get them on board with supporting or buying or distributing the show. Okay. So doing more of the post-production process on an animatic or an animated storyboard, if you will, not a horrible idea at a certain point in the business cycle. But as a producer or as an animator, it's counterproductive, which is the conclusion I've been very laboriously getting around to. You really want to do your ink and paint first. You know, with anime, with almost any animation that is going to be a commercially viable product, okay? We are not Walt Disney, and it is not 1997. Well, what does that mean? That means that we have got not only we have the obligation to do this production as economically as possible for a host of reasons. Number one, if you hit the mother lode and you get $1 million for your show, you'd like to pocket as much of that million as you can. Right? Number one. Number two, you want to get as much production value on the screen as possible for the least amount of time and work and sweat and toil and misery, possible, right? So the short story is, do the ink and paint before you get into timing. I think that is an important point to make because it's completely counterintuitive to what most people that are doing, Disney style 2D animation would probably want to do. They would probably want to say, well, okay, no, let's get the timing figured out. Let's get the pace. Let's be able to play it back and have it feel like a show as early as possible. And normally that would mean time out the pencil test. But as I'm looking at it, I'm going, no, that's really not a good idea. What you really want to do is develop your instinct so that you can look at this, again, as a comic book and just kind of know roughly how long things are going to take. In fact, it wouldn't be a bad idea to either write it down or in this case you could add memos. You could say 2 seconds. Let's say this is going to be 2 seconds and just make notes of it. Because, and in fact, I will even go a step further. I would even say, if her line's going to take 3 seconds actually. Instead of saying 3, let's go 3S5. Okay? Or maybe just 3-5. So and I'm literally spitballing here. I'm just making this up as I go on. But what does that do for me? That tells me that her shot is going to be 3 seconds long, roughly. And that after she says it, we're roughly at the 5-second point. Okay, so now at a glance in my X sheet, I kind of can see what's going on. I wonder how that looks in the timeline. Yeah, not... Okay, that is interesting. Look at this. Here, it's lined up with frame 7, but in the timeline view, okay, when I moved it fixed it. Okay, so in the timeline, by the way, another thing I learned today is you can use Control-Shift, actually, just Control. You can use Control-Shift mouse wheel to size it. So now this looks like the Krita timeline, frankly. That's what Krita's timeline looks like. And you can use Alt to kind of scroll around. It doesn't seem like you can use the mouse wheel to actually play, whereas in the X sheet you can. If you mouse over it, or actually if you mouse over your imagery and use Control Shift mouse wheel, it will go ahead and scroll it. So actually, let me do this real quick. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in the timeline, the key to this is you need to be over. You need to be over top of your visuals instead of over the timeline. Okay, so I'm going to shrink the timeline down. I'm going to go ahead and hit rewind, and as you can see, with Alt I can scroll around, but I'll bet you if I hit Control Shift mouse wheel here, yes, that's what works. So you need to have your mouse over the visuals in order to use your mouse wheel to just scroll around. So mouse wheel over the visuals lets you play back with Control Shift. Control Shift over the timeline lets you expand and contract it. Alt mouse wheel over the timeline lets you just jump from place to place. Okay. So getting back here, as I'm thinking this through and sort of, I'm advising you while I advise myself. I think this is probably a good workflow, especially because it's easy to change, sort of. What's hard to change about it would be this last number, the 5. Okay. So that's a little bit dangerous, because if this changes to 5 seconds, all of a sudden this is wrong. And this needs to be changed to 5 plus 3, which is 8. Okay, now why do I illustrate that? I'll tell you what. By the way, I didn't save my changes, so let's go ahead and save these. Let's post that, and let's change this to 8. Now this is actually, this is an important point. I want to really emphasize this. If you're just poking around with OpenTunes, or you're poking around with Blender, you're poking around with Krita, you're exploring animation, you want to draw things and you want to see your pictures move, and it's all very exciting. Great. What I just illustrated, what you will find, now remember, I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who's made a movie from start to finish where it was virtually a one-man show. So I know all aspects of this process, and I'm very well acquainted with what it takes to get that done. You know, it's 6 major events that each take about a month. You know, write it, cast it, direct it, you know, shoot it, edit it, post-production, score it. When you're into the real work, and you're not just poking around, this thing that I just showed you becomes one of the most important things you have to deal with. Because you come up with workflow concepts that where you discover that the next step you take breaks what you did earlier. And this is a great illustration of that. If I go back and I change this to 2 seconds again, what is that? Oh, font and stuff. Okay, I can live with that. So if I change this back to 2, now this is broken again. So what does that tell me? Well, this is such, trust me when I tell you, this is such a good example of the kind of thing that can really stop you in your tracks, because you can realize that a whole month of work, it's still usable, but it's kind of broken because all of your metadata is wrong now because you changed one thing upstream. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time in a complex workflow. You find the same thing if you're into any kind of engineering project. It isn't just in the creative realm. If you're designing a product and you're close to being ready to go into production and release this widget, and then somebody decides, you know what, we're going to save $400,000 in production cost if we change the size of this screw by 1/8 of a millimeter. Okay? We're going to have the same tensile strength, but we'll save, because our raw materials cost just went, dropped substantially. Okay, yeah, let's do that. Great idea. Now, all of our engineering drawings, all of our prototypes, everything that we did downstream from that original engineering design is now wrong. That's what I'm telling you, you will run into. So you learn. So then you begin to get pragmatic about your workflow, and you say, well, okay, if I have tools like Vegas, tools like OpenTunes with your nested timelines and your sub-X sheets, if you have, and you know, a lot of stuff in Blender with node-based compositing, if you have a workflow that allows you to work procedurally, where if I make a change upstream, it just propagates downstream, it's not a problem. This would be like in the manufacturing process. If you can change the size of the screws and then automatically all of your AutoCAD files get updated. All of your prototypes instantly and magically get rebuilt, you know, et cetera, et cetera. That would be a procedural workflow, as opposed to a hard-coded or baked-in kind of workflow. The minute you bake things in, you find you're asking for trouble if you're baking things into an element like this. This is an OpenTunes X sheet. Once you bake something into this X sheet that says this is the way it's going to be, it's a guarantee that later it's going to change. Now, why do I belabor this point? You know, why cry about it? If things change, you redo it. That's just part of the creative process. Definitely, that is true. But at the same time, why be stupid? You know, if you can identify these bottlenecks that are going to occur and cause you problems later, then you want to try to catch them early if you can. In this case, I think having post-it notes in here that give me an indicator of what the length of that shot is pretty useful. What would be even better, let's just give this a try right now. Alright, I'm just going to put 3 here and see what happens. Did it crash OpenTunes? Something happened. Okay. Alright, I'm going to push my luck here. And let's just pretend this one's going to be 3 as well. So I'm going to actually call that 3 also. Okay. So what if I change it to 5? Okay, as long as they're unique, OpenTunes does not assign a letter to them. So I'm going to go a step further and say that this workflow that I'm engineering like right now in real time on YouTube could be improved even more by going ahead and just changing the names of these drawings to represent the length of time they're going to be on the screen. Why? Because what if I rearrange them? What if I move this one down here? Okay, so let's say, let me see what the Q and the W key do here. If I go up 1, okay, it appears to keep the ordering the same, which is good. So if I put this here and that there, you know, so it appears that you can change the names of the cells. I don't think it changes the names of the images that are stored on the hard drive. So therefore, we could give a timing indicator here in the X sheet, which is great, because if I have to move this cell around and change the ordering, which has come up, frankly, just yesterday. Let me find it. This sequence here. This was going to be, I believe it was going to be boom, 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 boom. No. Let me see what we have here. It was going to be boom. Yeah, she notices. Something like that. And then I realized that it was more effective if she notices them and then catches the fact that they can see her, the rip in her dress, and so then she covers herself. So I rearranged it. Well, you know, guess what? That's going to happen. So the problem with the post-it notes, which I'm going to go ahead and delete right now, is if we use memos to indicate timing, then it probably won't happen a ton, but basically our workflow is now broken if we rearrange the frames, because we have to then remember Not only do we, well, actually, let me illustrate this. This is such a great example. Okay, that doesn't work. Never mind. Okay, it turns out that adding and deleting post-it notes or memos to the X sheet is not undoable. It doesn't fall into the action history for OpenTunes. So that's something I just learned right here, right now. Okay. Okay. Okay, so now, in fact, let me hit Control Z again. Yes. Okay, now we're back to normal. Okay, so the problem with the memos is if I move this cell, let's say I move it down here, or whatever, not only do I have to move the memo with it, but ostensibly I might have a whole bunch of memos that all have to be moved downstream. You know, we want to ripple edit it, as it were. So OpenTunes is really strong from the standpoint of ripple editing this way. It's great the way you can drag things around and everything else just adjusts accordingly. But so getting back to the top of this discussion, I want to say that my sense is that working in the small as opposed to working in the large, meaning just me as opposed to a large group, I tend to think that going straight from pencil test, well, actually from animatic or storyboard to ink and paint is probably a really good idea. Because then what's going to happen is I'm going to wind up with a level. If I had planned better, I could actually do it. I could do all the ink and paint right in this same level, which I would love to be able to do. I can't do it. Here's why. And by the way, if you actually have sat through this whole video and you want to post a comment to tell me how this could be solved, do so. I'm pretty sure it can't be solved, but here's the upshot of it. Most of the pencil work was done using palette entry number 1. Well, my thought was do all your pencils and then add more palette entries for ink, and once you have your ink in there, just literally delete the palette entry and delete the lines with it, leaving the ink behind. The problem is, if your pencils were created using palette entry number 1 or 0, either one, it would be normal to use 1. Palette entry number 1 cannot be deleted. 0 and 1 cannot be deleted. So therefore, I don't have a way to delete these lines. I can make them transparent, but that doesn't do me any good, because when I go to do flood filling, OpenTunes will still detect all these sketchy lines, and doing the paint will take forever. So, to illustrate what I mean by that is, let's just take, let's go Control C, Control V, and let's turn this back into a regular Tunes raster type ink level. Okay, and I'm just going to show you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, and I'll just ink her face to show what I mean. Okay, and before I do that, I'm going to take this, just make it real light. Make it real light. Okay. Now, I'm not going to do a proper ink job here because I don't want to take the time. I'm going to do it in a way that is relatively simple, and I'm going to pretend that she doesn't have any eyes. Okay, so now, for example, Control C, Control V, let's have a flesh tone, and I hit the F key. Okay, so you can see the problem. The problem is that these lines have interfered with the fill process, and it doesn't do any good to make these lines transparent. Now, if I deleted the palette entry by just going like that, you get a warning, it's not possible to delete styles 0 and 1. If I had done all my pencils with palette entry 2, then I could literally delete the palette entry and delete styles, lines, and areas, and everything that was drawn in that level would be deleted, and it would take all the lines with it, and now all I would be left with functionally is this, and my fill operations would be a piece of cake. So what I was hoping for in OpenTunes is a way to move the lines and areas from one palette entry to another. I don't know a way to do it. Now it's possible. The OpenTunes project files are text files, so you can open them up in an editor, and it could be that if I search carefully, maybe there's a way to just change the text to map all of these lines for this level to this palette entry instead of this palette entry. I think that's probably possible. I don't know why it wouldn't be, but the reason it wouldn't be is if OpenTunes actually takes the, let me see, let me go ahead and delete this ink so it's not confusing things. Okay, so the actual level file, which I believe with Tunes Raster, I believe is a TLV file. I think the TLV file is actually binary, kind of to my surprise. I had hoped that, and I'm not speaking authoritatively here, I didn't go very deep with this before I drew my conclusions, but it looks to me like with a TLV level that the entire sequence of images is a single thing, and as opposed to every time you draw a new cell, OpenTunes is saving an individual ping or TIFF file on disk, which I believe is what it does with a regular raster level. So the problem with the Tunes raster levels is they're binary. If you open them in a text editor, you get a bunch of gibberish because it's actually a binary format. And so if the color and line palette connection is made in the binary file, the level, we don't have a way to remap it. If the connection between the drawings and the palette entries is part of the Tunes project, the .tnz file, then there may be a way to remap it. So that's what I need to figure out. So anyway, for me, there's a fair amount of action still to go here at the end of this scene, but I'm thinking that I'm going to go ahead and do some ink and paint. I think I'm going to go ahead and finish some of these frames sort of so they're ready for timing. You know, they're ready to be timed. You know, this has been a very long-winded way of saying that doing audio and timing after the animatic is intuitively the right thing to do, logistically completely the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is do ink and paint, have finished art, and then time it. Especially because all of the ink and paint and color can be baked into a single level for the most part. Once you get into shadows, there's ways to approach shadows that might make that more difficult. Frankly, there are good reasons why it would be worth looking at doing ink and paint. I hate to say this, I shouldn't say this, but I was going to say ink and paint in Krita, because if you're working with a sequence of drawings like this where you're not really worried about timing things out, you're not dealing with the plastic tool, blah 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 blah. Krita, the one thing Krita does really nicely is deal with the relationship between levels or layers, so that doing shadows and stuff that are masked to their source layer, in other words the layer you're trying to add the shadows to, is really easy and it looks good. I mean, the quality of the visuals is good. But I actually downloaded the latest Krita like yesterday, or I think maybe it was the day before. I thought, let's give it a try. It's been a while. It's up to like 4.1.2 or whatever it is. And sure enough, it's so far behind what you can do in OpenTunes that it's laughable, frankly, for animation. Just the same stuff that's been true with Krita for months. You play back a timeline, and all of a sudden half the pictures start disappearing. Just really weird stuff, memory management stuff where it's like, this is not even close to being functional. You would never want to trust real production to this tool. I hate to say it, I wish it wasn't true, because the quality of the visuals is really pretty good. And if you keep it really simple and really small, it's pretty good. Basic ink and paint, all on one layer, maybe two, and then export it out of Krita, and then bring that sequence into OpenTunes for timing. That might be okay. The question then becomes, well, what have you gained compared to just doing it in OpenTunes? And the answer is not much. You want me to show you what you gain? I'll show you what you gain. I'll go ahead and show you. Because one other thing, the thing about Krita is it is good with really large files, as far as painting, as far as single image painting with lots of layers and blending modes and all this sort of thing. But what it's pretty good at, I would say, is I can take and create let's just make that black, by the way. Okay, so I'm going to create my character. Let's say I'm working with Ninja 1 here, since I've been drawing him a bit. Okay, so I'm just going to block in Ninja 1. And I hit the M key in Krita to flip the canvas. One good thing about Krita would be the horizontal mirroring tool, which allows you to obviously you could create a character in a front view like so, it's really nice. I mean, this is a really good way to work. So this alone makes Krita viable, although I have to say there is a way to do this in OpenTunes that isn't too bad. It requires you to use two levels and have one of them flipped with the animate tool. But anyway, so let's say this guy let's just get the sketch in and call it good. Okay, so here he is. Okay, so now the question becomes, well, what are we going to do about ink and paint? Well, what I would do is probably turn this layer down, turn it up a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to go to my brush, and this again is where you're going to see that the quality of the lines and whatnot in OpenTunes are quite good. I'm going to turn on my stabilizer so that I get really clean curves. So the stabilizer is pretty good, but again, it's certainly no better than the one built into OpenTunes. So I'm going to just draw this really quick so that you can see where Krita excels. I will say that the quality of the lines here, quite good. Quite good. I'm not going to bother with this ponytail. Okay, so now going back to the layers, I would kill this layer, and then what I would normally do is you got two options. You can add a layer above, and Krita is going to respect the lines from the adjacent layers. Okay, so what that gives me the ability to do is something of this nature. Boom, boom. Okay, now if I didn't want to put it on that layer, I could go into behind mode as far as my blending modes go and essentially accomplish the same thing. But you can only do it once, because once you've painted it, the behind mode will appear to do nothing. If I click now, it does nothing because it's actually painting behind the paint that I already put on there. So I generally tend to work in 2 levels. So we've got our 2 levels, and now we're saying, well, what about shadows? This is where Krita is great. All right, and I'm going to take the big brush, and I'm just going to go like so. All right, and I can turn this down. And let's go ahead and get these shadows in here. And I need to turn this stabilizer off. Doesn't really help you much. But see, so it's so cool that you can really just go outside the lines and pretty much be a slop hog with it. And then you just turn on the lock alpha and adjust your opacity to taste. And of course you can also add highlights in the same way that you added the shadows. And the thing is, if you look at this, the quality of this imagery is really quite good. It looks crisp. It looks professional. You know, it's kind of hard to criticize. If I want to go back in here and make some adjustments, can do so. If I say I want to bake some opacity into my brushes so that I can do more complex layered shadowing. So instead of doing shadowing at the layer level, you're doing it at the brush level. You know, etc., etc., etc. You can do it. So anyway, bottom line is it looks pretty good. The problem is when you get multiple layers in a timeline that's supposed to play back, what I found is invariably things start breaking. You'll play it back and like a quarter of the image will just not be there. It's like they've got the memory tiled and stuff just disappears, and it actually renders that way. You know, just weird things. So it's one thing that's good though with Krita is that it saves everything as a monolithic file. So if I have, you know, 30 frames of imagery and it's all inked and painted, and I save it, it's all baked right there into the Krita file. So when I reopen that Krita file, that entire project in the state I left it is restored, which is a good thing. That's the opposite of working procedurally. Working procedurally says that if I were to go in my file browser and grab this image and drag it into Krita or drag it into GIMP and paint it, then when I open up OpenTunes, I get the painted version of the image. So there's a time to be procedural, and there's a time to bake things in, and it has to do with preserving your work in case you need to come back to it later versus wanting the things that you've done to propagate downstream. So, and these are just all considerations that come into play all the time in the real world. It just does. Now I'll show you an example of where I'm going to see if I can get Krita to break here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these 3 and let's see here. I thought there was a way to, yeah, let's group these. Let's do a quick group. Yeah, it creates this layer, and then if I'm not mistaken, pass through should be turned on. Okay, so why would I do that? Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert a keyframe, which doesn't seem to do anything. So now I say, well, I want to scale my character appropriately. So let's say this is actually more like the scaling that I needed. And I'm going to hit Control Insert and see if it, yeah, see. So this is in my view a bit of a shortcoming. The good thing is that the things I did to the group layer propagated through procedurally to the other layers. The bad news is, to this day, for reasons I can't understand, is if you do any animation stuff on a group layer, and you can do group animation, there's nothing visual to tell you what you did, unless you show the other levels in the timeline. So in a way, does that kind of sort of make sense? Yeah, I guess it maybe does. Let me see here. Let's add an existing layer. Let's go ahead and add these 3 layers. Let's add layer 4. Let's add layer 2. And let's add layer 1. Okay. And now I go to layer 5. And what's interesting is now it seems to be showing me, that's kind of weird, but I'll take it. No, it's not. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that what would I want to do in practice here? Okay, there you go. There's Krita right there. I click on the group, ostensibly to you know, animate it or something with this transform tool. And the first time I did it, it worked fine. But now, let me see what happens if I do this. Okay. Okay, so what seems to be going on here? Okay, I'm going to tell you what. I think this is what's going on. I think this is what's going on. I'm going to go Control Insert. This is we're definitely finding bugs right now. But I think this is what's going on. Until Krita knows that this is a level. Why is layer 1 showing? Let's get rid of layer 1. Okay, so I wanted to show layers 2, 3, and 4. So let's go here. So you know, this is kind of what I'm talking about. There's sort of some housekeeping. You know, you had to deal. Okay, that's all right. I can deal with some housekeeping. So let's go to layer 3, and let's go Control Insert. So we're inserting a keyframe. I think this is what the problem is. The pass-through feature only works if you've already put in some keyframes in the constituent layers. So now I'll bet you it's going to work. Yep. Watch. Okay. Now, yep, and see, it did. Now it passes through. So it's not like there's not a way to make this work. There is a way to make it work, but you can see what's going on right now. Okay. I'm like right in the middle, and I say, well, now what I want to do is put in an in-between. And I click it, and it like jumps around. Okay. And it appears to have moved this keyframe to here. Okay, this is what I think we can do. I think this can work. Let's go ahead and move these back up to, let's just say 24. Okay. So now I think what has to happen, and this is jumping properly. Actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make it way over here just so it's really clear. I think what we need to do here is insert a keyframe. Let's insert a keyframe. And see what happened. Okay. It's a little strange. It's a little strange. But it seems to me that this keyframe is not where it was supposed to be. And you see, I'm clicking and things are jumping all over. And it's like, it's like, really? Is this how it's supposed to work? So, you know, you can just see, I'm not trying to be negative. It's just really difficult to work with. So therefore, my basic attitude is I don't do animation with Krita. I just don't. Let's just convert that to a paint layer and see what happens. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so now this is interesting because if you go ahead and flatten it, guess what happens? Now it does okay. And this is kind of what I was saying. So if I was going to do this ink and paint in Krita, this is what I would do. Number one, I would take the straight pencil sequence like this with no timing involved, just the sequence of drawings, and I would bring that into Krita, which it does a pretty good job of doing. It will import. And in OpenTunes, the way I would do that is I would hit Control R, which is going to create a preview window, And then what I can do is just hit this button right here, and it will save the rendered images. And by the way, the reason the color was showing is because this particular frame has, adds color to some of the frames. Okay, so now I can export that image sequence. I can bring it into Krita, and then what I would do is, I wonder if I can undo this. Let's just see. I just want to get rid of the group. Okay, so one thing good on Krita is the undo seems to, it seems to do a really good job. So what I would do is I would have this image sequence now, and I would set up several layers for shadows, ink, and paint, and just go ahead and go in and paint them one by one, and then re-render that image sequence out of Krita and bring it back into OpenTunes and do all the timing there. That could work. And to be fair, I want to make this point as well. The thing about OpenTunes that I found to be so problematic with animation has mostly to do with using the transform tool. And like I just illustrated here, it has to do with getting a group to predictably propagate its changes down to the layers that are part of the group. I don't know that the Krita documentation claims that you should even be able to do this, okay? It seems like it should, but I don't know if they really make that claim. The big weakness, by the way, in OpenTunes is there is no interpolation. So if you use the translate tool, and let's say you take, let's just go ahead and flatten this again. Okay, so if I take this and then I go to here and move it over here, OpenTunes, there is no way in OpenTunes to interpolate between these two positions. So for the workflow I'm describing here, that doesn't matter because you're just dealing with individual drawings. So essentially what it means is that Krita sucks for finished animation, but it's actually pretty good for the middle section, which could include the pencil test. I mean, everything I've done here could have been done in Krita, could have been done in Blender with the grease pencil. It doesn't matter. Use whatever you want to use. And then once you're at the point of ink and paint, you sort of have to start making some decisions, right? And so again, I want to emphasize, I can't say that for straight ahead ink and paint, and certainly for all kinds of different painting processes, Krita actually has a lot going for it. Definitely in terms of the quality of the finished art, it's very nice. I think what I needed to do here was I noticed that I lost my shadow when I think what you have to do is grab all of your level or layers and hit Control E. Yes, if you collapse them all at once in one step, then the relationship between all the layers is preserved. I think if you do it individually, then it kind of goes screwy on how it combines them. So what you would want to do is something like that. And then, and if you're willing to take your time, you could do some, of this sort of stuff. Right? So it's all doable. It's a little on the clunky side. That's all. But it's not completely horrible. When it gets horrible is when you wind up with multiple layers that have animation in them, especially if there's grouping involved. It gets really ugly. And by the way, it gets really, really memory intensive as well. This looks like it's 9 megabytes. It's nothing. But I've had projects with, say, maybe just like 50 frames and 3 or 4 layers. If there's a bunch of animation, all of a sudden, and adjustment layers. See, that's again where Krita is nice, is you can do adjustment levels. You can do, you can tint your backgrounds. There's a lot of things you can do that, if you break it into pieces and then bring those finished pieces into other applications like like OpenTunes, for example. Um, a lot of the intermediate and preliminary work can be done in Krita, and can be a lot of fun and quite effective. Okay. As far as I can tell, Krita and oh gosh, what are they calling Manga Studio now? I guess it's Clip Studio Paint. Had very similar capabilities. They seem to be pretty much parity last time I checked. But I guess the final thing I'll say is, because I've been blabbing for an hour, is that everything I've demonstrated here can be done in OpenTunes pretty much just as well, if not better. And that's why lately I just don't tend to jump around that much. Is Krita's ability to handle shadows and highlights actually a killer feature? Pretty close. It's pretty close. It looks real good, and it gives really good results. To do the same thing in OpenTunes, you're either going to have to get into a sub-X sheet with a plastic tool to provide the clipping, or you're going to have to use a post-production effect, which means you're only going to see your shadows clipped when you do a final render. Is that the end of the world? No. It's fine. I mean, it's probably how most of the world would go ahead and do it. Who cares if your shadows aren't clipped until you render? Why does that matter? It's just a personal preference. So Krita is giving you the ability to see the final result quicker and more interactively in the process. So anyway, okay, that's a lot of blabbing, but hopefully you'll agree there have been some good tips here today. There have been some things that I've sort of reiterated to myself in terms of my workflow. My next step is going to be to go ahead and do ink and paint. And as I'm saying this right now, I am debating whether I'm going to go ahead and do some tests where I do some of the ink and paint in Krita. I think not. And here's the main reason why. It's a biggie. The Tunes raster levels allow you to hit the K key and select a palette entry and instantly make adjustments to that palette entry after the fact. That's a killer feature too. That's a tough one to beat. So for that reason, I still tend to be located in OpenTunes. But having said that, if you knew what your palette was, if you pretty well have your palette figured out, and you're using fairly saturated colors, and you figure we're going to do our color correction after the fact. So all of our characters are always going to be colored as if it was perfect daylight, no tinting. That's always for post-production. If you're going to work that way, Krita would be a good way to work. You create a character sheet, drag that into another layer in Krita so you can use the eyedropper to sample the colors that you need when you need them. And, as long as you can kind of stick to a plan, Krita could be a good option for that. So, anyway, that's it for now. A lot of blabbing, but hopefully useful to somebody. And I'm going to definitely just keep rocking on this thing because it's starting to look good. I think we're getting there. So anyway, that's it for now.